Oh, fantastic. So I know it's been a long day for you guys at CPAC, so I'm really glad you stuck around. I'll introduce myself. I'm Jillian Melcher. I'm a political editor at Heat Street, and I do energy and environment issues for the Independent Women's Forum, and I'm also with the Steamboat Institute. So I'm thrilled that you guys stuck around. I think energy can be a topic that makes people's eyes glaze over, and it definitely shouldn't. Because if you get down to the crux of it, this is an issue that immediately affects American households in a way that few policies do. And it's also really interesting. I mean, it's literally what's powering our country. It's literally an issue that's fraught with corruption, with cronyism. So I think we're going to have a good time talking about it today. Basically, what I wanted to do is begin with an anecdote that I think really illustrates how this issue hits home to American families, and I didn't have to look too far for it. You're trying to think of an example, and I kind of realized the example was me. When I first moved to New York City, right out of college, I was pretty broke, as most writers in New York actually are. And I was living in a studio apartment. We had 2 beds right next to each other, 3 girls in it. We called it the 2-bedroom apartment. And energy bills were a huge source of contention. I mean, you can imagine you're already in tight quarters. That extra $20 that you spend on energy, that was a real pressure for us. So I think back and I remember this one particular summer day. It was just sweltering. And none of us could really afford to turn the air conditioning on. And so we went to the grocery, we bought $2 frozen corn, and we slept packed on frozen corn. It worked okay. But I think that illustrates how immediately this affects American families, and I'm certainly not unique in that. There are many families that are far worse off, pulling themselves out of poverty, and this is a major obstacle to it. So I want to talk, first of all, about who Obama's economic, environmental policies affect. And then I want to talk a little bit about America's current energy situation and some of the threats to it. And then I want to zone in on the issue of, does Obama's energy policy even do what it sets out to do? Is this legitimate concerns that it's addressing, or is this simple alarmism? And I think when you line all of those 3 things up, putting the human face on it and then looking about how much it costs and what it sets out to accomplish and how effective it is, we end up with a pretty damning criticism of these policies. So for starters, I want to talk about how this disproportionately affects poor and minority families. And the statistics on this are absolutely staggering. I mean, if you look in dollar terms alone, energy prices consume 1/3 of the take-home pay, pre-tax, for families earning under $30,000 a year. JP Morgan Chase has found that gasoline gobbles up 5.6% of the income for families in the lower 20th percentile. And then in addition to that, black families end up spending 50% more of their take-home pay on energy, on utilities, than white families do. With Latino families, it's about 10% more of their income than white families do. So this is a racial issue. Additionally, I think for many families that are in this dangerous sort of compromised position where energy prices can really undermine their financial stability, when energy prices go up because of bad policy, it ends up forcing them into difficult choices. And I was kind of surprised by the numbers on this. If you look at, there was a 2011 survey. It was by the National Energy Assistance Directors Association. And it found out that about 1 in 4 people who are low income who've been faced with high utility bills gave up going to the doctor, gave up going to the dentist. Even more shocking, I think, 1 in 4 of them ended up, going without food for a day because their utility bills were so high. 1 in 5 of them, these households, ended up having someone in their family actually get physically sick because they couldn't afford to heat their house. That's crazy. I mean, that's a really immediate effect that this has. So energy is actually an income inequality issue, and it's shameful that Democrats aren't addressing this, in my opinion. I think conservatives have a great opportunity to address this because these are stories that pull at the heartstrings, and I want to share 2 of them with you that have come straight out of newspapers in recent years. The first is a woman, her name's Betty Lanning. She's in North Carolina, really interesting old lady. She ended up having her husband die. She was low income, took home about $1,000 with her Social Security. That was all she had for the month. And her daughter fell on hard times, so she's the one that stepped up. She decided that she was going to take care of her family, take this granddaughter in, and she was going to make it work. But with $1,000 a month to cover all of her energy expenses, she did the math, and pretty quickly she realized that $3 a gallon, or $3 a barrel or a gallon heating oil was really going to throw her budget under stress. I mean, we're talking $300 out of that $1,000 paycheck she has every month, just going to keeping her house warm. So she ended up having to make hard choices. She ended up not taking her medication. Here you've got this woman, old woman with a baby, going and standing in a food pantry line. And she's seeking out government assistance. They subsidize it. She still can't afford the energy she needs. She still can't make ends meet. She goes to charities. That just barely manages to cover it. But here you've got somebody trying really hard to do the right thing, and energy is blocking their ability to provide for their family. So I think with people in that situation, the Obama administration's energy policy has been devastating. And I'll give you another example that's a personal example that puts a face to it. This is out of Colorado. And I think Colorado really foreshadows what some of the Obama administration policies are going to do. Because in 2010, they ended up passing legislation. It was called the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act. And what it basically did was it resulted in several power plants closing down, much like the Clean Power Plan will do. So in Pueblo, Colorado, poverty rate 18.5%, the natural gas plant shut down, 2 coal-fired plants shut down. All of a sudden, you see energy shoot through the roof. And this is what happened to a woman named Sharon Garcia. She was a daycare owner, ran it out of her household. And in 2010, right after this policy takes effect, she got her lights cut out. I mean, we're talking about somebody who's trying to run a daycare. This is her home business. And she's having a hard time making it function because she can't afford, immediately when this policy takes effect, can't afford energy. She's boiling water in a bathtub for people to be able to bathe. She's, using candles to light her house at night, and she's talking to the newspaper about how afraid she is that her house is going to burn down. So she manages to get her power turned back on. Scrapes all her cash together, devotes it to this. Over the next 4 years, because of this destructive policy, she saw her energy bill increase 26%. We're talking about a woman who's paying $850 a month for rent. On top of that, $200 a month for utility. That's outrageous. But I think it's very much foreshadowing of what particularly low-income families are going to experience soon. So that's unfortunate because it certainly doesn't have to be this way. Right now, the United States is going through this incredible energy renaissance. Hydraulic fracturing, you've probably heard fracking. It's controversial, shouldn't be. But right now, we've recently figured out how to do horizontal drilling. What that basically allows us to do as a country is tap into these energy reserves that are unprecedented. We've never been able to get into these before. And as a result, we've seen the US overtake Saudi Arabia as the world's top oil producer. We've seen the US overtake Russia as the world's top natural gas producer. I mean, this is huge. We're closer to energy independence than we've ever been before. So the federal government actually expects that because of this, throughout 2016, we're going to see gas prices below $2. That's incredible. I mean, I grew up, learning to drive, pulling up next to the pump and seeing $4, $5 a gallon gas. We never thought this was going to happen again. This is brought to you by the private sector. This is brought to you by the free market. And it's resulting in huge savings for families. Last year, gas was more expensive than it's expected to be this year. Still, people are taking home about $550 a year that they wouldn't be taking home if they had to spend it at the pump. So that's already a huge, huge benefit to low-income families, to all American families. You're seeing that trickle down. We've got cheaper consumer goods as a result, because energy is a huge input into manufacturing. We've got cheaper food. It's a huge input into the food manufacturing process. And our winter is just wrapping up. The federal government actually noted that this winter we're going to spend way less on energy prices than we have the past 2 years. Now, you can say that's because it's been unseasonably warm. Okay, let's look back at 2015. That's the year of the Arctic freezes, or whatever we're going to call them. That year, the Northeast alone ended up having heating oil fall below $3 a gallon. The net result, $3 billion in savings just for the Northeast of the United States. Huge savings, ton of money in consumer pockets. The bad news, though, is that the federal government's policies can compromise these gains. And I think it's worth noting that on one hand, you've got low-income families. On one hand, you've got minority families. You've got middle-class families where, you still notice if you've got $50 missing because you had to spend it unnecessarily on energy. On the other hand, you have the bureaucrats that are writing this policy. Comfortably middle class, possibly upper class. Largely live in DC, where, about 4 in 10 do not drive to work. 90% of us, in real America do drive to work every day and have to worry about this. So I think there's a real disparity and a disconnect. And unfortunately, these policies are going to have huge economic consequences. So they're being really aggressive. I mean, we already know that Obama's first term in office alone, the EPA issued 20 major regulations. Major regulations are basically defined as rules that are going to have a $100 million economic impact or more. That $100 million was super lowballed. It ended up being about $7 billion annual compliance costs, just from those first 4 years alone. Same amount of time. They ended up having annual compliance costs. So the $7 billion was the initial cost, sorry. Annual compliance cost was $44 billion every year. That's just within the first 4 years when Obama isn't focusing on environmental regulations like he is right now. In the first 10 months of the president taking office, we saw more environmental regulation go through than under Bill Clinton's entire tenure. And Bill Clinton was not a guy who was shy about environmental green regulation. First 4 years, we saw a total of 1,824 environmental regulations, small, big, all sizes. And these are really intervening in people's lives. I mean, there's discussion right now about whether the EPA should be monitoring your backyard barbecue, whether it should be looking at your furnace. Just all these things that kind of nitpick you and drive you crazy and cost you money. So now we've got a president focusing on environmental regulation in his second term, and I think we're really seeing this in the last year and a half going forward in particular. So 2015, across all agencies, was record-breaking for federal regulation. So much of this is targeted at environmental regulation. It's an onslaught. So with these environmental regulations, we know they're going to have a huge cost. I think the American public needs to do a cost-benefit breakdown, and it also needs to look at, do these regulations address a problem that is real, or do they kind of address a problem that's inflated or kind of cushioned in alarmism? And the answer is many of them are pretty alarmist. So we're going to go through 2 of the key environmental policies that we've seen under the Obama administration. I'll kind of do the breakdown for you. But I think this is illustrative of the overall approach, all of those regulations, more than 1,000 of them. I think you could do similar, examinations and find pretty comparable results. So first of all, we've got the ozone rule. Right now, the environmental standard is you can have 75 parts per billion. That's kind of wonky. It's going to bring it down to 70 parts per billion. Here's what you need to know about this. The EPA, which consistently lowballs regulations, has admitted that this is going to be one of the most expensive regulations across all agencies in history. That's the EPA saying it. The EPA says that this regulation is going to cost up to $1.4 billion a year, at least. And private sector thinks that's actually going to be considerably higher. NERA, at the behest of the National Association of Manufacturers, crunched the numbers, found that this regulation alone is going to reduce the GDP by $140 billion a year. It's going to cost the average household $830 every single year. And it's also going to cost millions of jobs. So big costs. Do we actually have a smog problem? No, we don't. We've seen smog going down consistently for the past 4 decades. And I think the statistic that really drove this home to me is that there are about 24 national parks that don't meet the EPA's current standards. So that includes Yosemite's Turtleback Dome, Sequoia, and my favorite of these was Joshua Tree National Park. I like that one because the state of California, where it's located, issued this really great description talking about how Joshua Tree National Park doesn't meet Obama administration's ozone levels, doesn't meet current ozone levels, has incredibly pristine air. National Park Service wrote about their clean air. Here's what they said. It is an oasis for people who are subjected to air congestion, automobile pollution, and disappearing open space. This is the national park that doesn't meet current standards, much less the new standards that the Obama administration is going for. So if we're looking at cities, if we're looking at counties, they basically have no hope of meeting this. In fact, many of them are currently out of compliance, even as the EPA intends to tighten the thumb screws, if you will. And so they're going to be forced to adopt really costly regulation in an attempt to meet a standard that is just wildly unrealistic, wildly unnecessary. And the EPA, if you kind of read between the lines on some of its stuff, it's a little bit funny. The EPA gives some suggestions for how cities and counties are supposed to meet this unattainable standard. It says about 1/3 of the way that it's going to do it is through unknown measures, which is basically a bureaucrat throwing up his hands going, we don't know how you're going to do it, but by the way, it's regulated. So the EPA has made the case for these incredibly stringent ozone regulations based on what's basically junk science. And you can tell this because there are 23 physicians in Congress. They wrote a letter to the agency. They said basically, all of the studies that you cite have their roots in politics. They don't have their roots in science. We're looking at studies with really small sample sizes, studies with poor controls, studies that put people in really unlikely scenarios with ozone. And that does actually bear out. I mean, one of the EPA's studies, they took this scientist who looked at exercise in ozone. He came to the conclusion that it was safe. The EPA took his study, slapped a different thesis on it, said that this is dangerous, and decided to use it to justify the ozone rule. So this author was pretty ticked off by it. He ended up writing into the EPA, and he kind of scolded them, said that they had, quote, misinterpreted the statistics contained in my published and peer-reviewed paper. That's not all the EPA does to justify it. They've used decades-old data on ozone levels to justify regulations right now when things have improved. They've also, in some cases, cited data sets that when people go to them and say, okay, great, we want to see it, show your work, EPA won't show them the data. That's not an agency acting out of good faith. So bottom line on this particular regulation, national parks can't meet it. Americans shouldn't have to. Incredibly expensive, terrible bang for your buck. Which the trend continues when we talk about the second major regulation that the Obama administration is pursuing, which is the Clean Power Plan. So what this regulation is going to do is over the next 15 years, they want to cut carbon levels by 32% over 2005 levels. Now, that's going to be insanely expensive. One private sector study estimates that this is going to cost American consumers about $39 billion every single year. They also found out that once this regulation goes into effect, all but a handful of states are going to experience double-digit electricity price hikes. The states that aren't going to experience them, by the way, have already gone so aggressive with their environmental regulations that all of their consumers are already paying insane prices. This is such a dramatic restructuring of the energy grid. I mean, we saw in Pueblo with a very similar piece of legislation. Right off the bat, coal plant shut down, natural gas plant shut down. This is something that can compromise the security of the entire American energy grid. Now, what I think is so interesting about this is the gap between what the Obama administration has promised this regulation will do and the reality of it. So the Obama administration has basically argued that this is critical for addressing climate change, that this is groundbreaking, it's totally revolutionary. I want to read you an Obama quote. He called this quote, the single most important step America has ever taken in the fight against global climate change, ever. Well, that doesn't really pan out. The actual impact, keep in mind that we're not really the problem globally. The United States accounts for about 5% of total carbon emissions. So that means that if we were going to cut off all of our carbon emissions, go back to the dark ages, we all throw away our cars, turn off our lights, pull out the candles forever. The impact on climate change is about 0.15 degrees Celsius. That's all we have to work with. Not really the problem. But this regulation doesn't even go that far. Despite the $39 billion annual cost to consumers, it's going to have an impact on climate that is less than, wait for it, 0.02 of 1 degree Celsius by 2100. That is a level that is so minuscule, I actually had to call around and find what kind of specialized scientific equipment you would need to measure it. This is not going to have a huge impact on climate change. Okay, rising sea levels, maybe it's going to have an effect there. Nope. About 2 sheets of paper, that's how much the sea levels are going to go down as a result of this. That's not good. That's not a good use of our money. So the Obama administration has argued, okay, maybe this is symbolic. The United States needs to set an example. We need to get big emitters like China and India to start taking their environment issues seriously. So they say that this is going to be the policy that does it. It's going to get them on board. Well, there's a precedent there too. The US inked the US-China emissions deal. China's pollution is insane. I've lived there. You break out in hives. You go on a 5-minute walk and your lungs hurt. China needs to address this. China's not going to address it because the Obama administration wants them to. I mean, if it hasn't done it with the internal pressure, I don't think that the United States symbolic example is going to change their heart. And in fact, we do see exactly that occurring. So the US government makes this commitment based on the Clean Power Plan, 32% reduction in emissions by 2015. Huge economic commitment. Here's what China promises. By 2030, the same year that we're going to have finished all of these massive cuts, it's going to stop increasing carbon emissions, which is a fancy way of saying, for the next 15 years while we cut back, China's going to grow it. They get to do whatever they want. They don't have to do anything for 15 years. And China has done exactly that. I mean, the New York Times reported just a few months ago that in the last year alone, China gave the okay on permits for 155 dirty coal-fired power plants. That is roughly the equivalent of 40% of the US operational coal grid. So they're scaling up in a huge way. We're making this economic sacrifice. I don't think that this is working how the Obama administration wanted it to work. Now with China, I think it's not going to work that way, period, because they are not a democratic regime. Their legitimacy rests on their promise that they made of economic prosperity, economic growth. The deal that they made with their citizens is, you give us the political freedoms, we'll help you economically succeed. I can't see the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing deciding that just because the United States is setting such a great example, just because they're doing the stand-up thing, we're going to do something that's fundamentally going to jeopardize our control on power of China to please Obama. This is a bad deal. We saw this too with the Paris Climate Conference. The Obama administration talked that up. This is revolutionary. We've got all these countries signing on. No, this was done like a potluck. Every country brought what they could bring. It's not legally binding, and there's no way of enforcing it. So once again, the United States' symbolic example is not yielding the results that we want it to, but it is having a huge economic consequence, and that disproportionately affects our most vulnerable citizens. I think these two policies, I've chosen to focus on them because I think they really show that the Obama administration's environmental agenda is symbolic, it is not practical, it is not effective, and it is extraordinarily costly. The solution to this is the free market, to allow the free market to be doing what it's doing already. With natural gas, it's far less carbon intensive than coal is. So we are already seeing carbon levels at the lowest that they've been in 20 years. That's not the government, that's the private sector. And I think what's so empowering is that conservatives have the high ground on this message. This is private industry. This is creativity. This is American jobs. This is us using our private enterprise, our American will, to save money to help our most vulnerable citizens. And if that's not conservative, I don't know what is. Thank you so much for coming to hear me. I hope this was enlightening to you, and I hope you had fun. Yep.
Okay, 3 points.
All right.
First point is, by the U.S. Constitution, any treaty we sign and ratify has the effect of law for us, which does not occur with any other countries. So we are, Obama, by agreeing to treaties, is tying our hands.
It's not a treaty. See, this is the weird way it's being done. It's an agreement.
But, well,
It's a bit of an overreach.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's shocking that this is our...
Pink and lipstick come around. Secondly, the cost of energy, when you're talking about energy bills for the poor, but also their ability to earn money is affected by the cost of energy because they may not be able to work full-time because their boss cannot afford to pay them for full-time work and pay his own utility bills.
Yeah, you were spot on about that.
So it's a vicious cycle for the poor.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as conservatives, we need to be getting that message across. I mean, as a country, we're obsessed with income inequality right now. We're obsessed with disparate racial treatment. These are two examples where liberal policies, where leftist economic policies are disproportionately harming the people that they say they want to protect. I think we should all be calling them out on it.
And thirdly, if they really wanted to get rid of tons of carbon emissions, they should outlaw making movies and television. I was shocked a few years ago. I was watching a program that was actually made in Great Britain. It was an hour-and-a-half program, and at the end it said how many tons of carbon were created by making this television show. And I'm like, okay, that's an hour-and-a-half of TV out of how many stations, how many hours per week, how many weeks per year, and we're not even getting to the let's go blow up a few cars movies.
Yeah, it's totally unrealistic. I mean, if you looked at Paris Climate Conference, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was hilarious to see the emissions count for the major players. Like, if we're serious about this, why are we not doing the conference by Skype? Why do you need your private jet going out there to have Michelin meals flown in from around the globe? I mean, they're just not serious about it. It's for everybody else.
Well, again, it's the arrogance of the ruling class versus
Yeah, exactly. You had a question.
Well, I'm wondering, do you happen to know, let's say, the good guys get the White House.
Yeah.
Can they use executive orders to get rid of these?
Yeah, I mean, it's...
How fast can they get rid of them? I mean, they got a pen and say, everything Obama did in the EPA, goodbye. By the way, we're moving to selling the building, the EPA said, we're moving into Dubuque. Actually, not Dubuque, 30 miles outside of Dubuque.
Well, it's being done by executive order, so I think you could do it that way. One of the really important things right now is the Supreme Court battle. So Clean Power Plan, you have 24 states that are challenging this regulation. Control of the Supreme Court is going to be really important for determining the fate of that regulation in particular. I think also one of the things that we should point out is we're talking about the next election as a whole, is with these regulations, we want to be doing them through Congress. We want to be repealing them through Congress so we're not over-exercising the power of the pen in a way that I think the Obama administration has expanded presidential power in a way that's not good for... We might disagree on that point, but I like where you're coming from.
Wouldn't we get rid of it? I mean, I'm a manufacturer. Wouldn't we get rid of it faster if we used executive? I mean, why be the good guy right now? This is war.
I mean, you can certainly make that argument.
And I know.
I probably wouldn't on principle, but I think it's worth debating. You had a question?
Congress has oversight on EPA. EPA is administering these regulations.
Mm-hmm.
Why not cut the budget of EPA? I know Congress, we have a problem with Congress being a little gutsy, but why not advocate EPA budget be cut? Since a lot of these executive actions have no force of law because they've not been ratified by Congress. It's not
Yeah.
true.
Yeah, I
Way
mean,
to go.
it's been hard to cut the budget on federal growth. I agree with your point, absolutely. I will say that Congress did pretty quickly after Clean Power Plan, both the House and the Senate voted to repeal it, sent it to the Obama administration, veto. Yoron?
Yeah, basically responding back to your, I would think if they use a double action approach, number one, the immediacy to repeal, can anything done by executive action can be repealed by executive action. And number two, exactly what she answered, follow that up with legislature and the Congress that gets rid of these other things by law and also sets forth whatever are scientifically based real concerns. That's, to me, this whole debate on the atmosphere. We're arguing, we're giving them the premise, the basic premise of the existence of man caused global warming and or climate change, and both of them are 100% baseless, and the facts are there for proof that there's no science whatsoever to support it. There is local air pollution and water pollution, totally different subject, but their mission is all into things that get into regulations which are, I think, what she said combined with what you said,
Yeah.
immediately repeal everything by executive action and follow that by laws passed by 2020.
I mean, the tough thing on that is, and the tough thing on checking any of this, is you end up scaring industry. So they're already hedging their bets in case these things go through, in case Congress can't do it, in case the Supreme Court can't tear this down. They're making changes that are really hard to reverse. So I think when the Obama administration is aggressive in the way that it's been aggressive with its green policy, even if we do get a victory, it's so strung out through courts, it's almost Pyrrhic. Yeah.
I think this budget is really helpful breakdown on the costs and the effectiveness of the regulation. It's interesting that we're at a moment when energy has become a hot topic for everyone. Who would have expected that? The Exxon investigation is popular with people. The fossil fuel investment is started on college campuses. You mentioned that these policies won't be effective at stopping climate change, and maybe they're symbolic. I'm curious if you think there might be another reason that they are political motivators to capture the votes of people who are disproportionately concerned about climate change and kind of want the cause to belong to environmentalism. Is that cause for that? Do you think that is factoring into this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got the left. I think they've been very sophisticated with their messaging on this. I mean, who doesn't care about the earth? Who doesn't want to be a good steward? Who doesn't want clean water? Conservatives really need to be pushing the message that we do have a system in place where we are good stewards, where we care about the same things that you care about. We just don't want to be throwing a ton of taxpayer money. And in particular, we don't want to be holding, I think, America's most vulnerable ransom when not that much is accomplished. That message hasn't gotten out, so I'm not really surprised that young people are eating it up. Hopefully they'll grow up. Yeah. Oh, one more question? All right, who's got it? No? All right, we'll finish it off. Thank you, guys.